Hello, everyone. Welcome to Filmcopath. Our esteemed guest today is a renowned computer scientist as well as a gifted artist. He did his master's from the Indian Statistical Institute and later followed it up with a PhD in artificial intelligence from the University of Illinois, Chicago. For the next 20 years, he was involved with various aspects of digital technology, headed the technology group at Encyclopedia Britannica, and only recently shifted his primary focus to making art. Today we have with us Dr. Kunal Sen. And if still few of you are wondering why we have a person from a different field for a discussion on cinema today, it is because Dr. Sen also has an identity beyond his varied self-earned achievements. He is the son of actor Geeta Sen and legendary Indian filmmaker Mrinal Sen. We have this conversation with Kunalda today in our humble attempt to celebrate the birth centenary of our beloved Mrinal Sen. Kunalda, welcome to Filmcopath.
Namaskar. Thank you.
We read your book Bondhu, reminiscing about your father, which we loved and enjoyed. And I would like to start with a question on that. You mentioned in
Sure.
your book, you mentioned in your book that Mrinal Sen, like many of his peers, was motivated by the idea of making the world a better place. However, if we look at his filmography, his more politically loaded films come in the second phase of his filmmaking, starting from Interview in a distinct way. Of course, there were distinct elements of politics in his earlier films, but more subtle perhaps. Can you tell us about the inspiration and thinking process in his early phase of filmmaking, say during Neelakashan Niche, Baishe Shravon, or Akash Kushum, which were social dramas with some political elements but subdued?
So, first of all, when he made those films, I was too young to understand or remember anything. So, whatever I say, it's as a viewer, not knowing him or knowing his mental process. I think his political motivation was mostly from the reading that he did in his student days and which had a left liberal leaning. And I haven't even seen all of his earlier films because some of them are not available. But whatever I have seen, you can see a political analysis of a situation. So even if it is the relationship between a husband and a wife, it's a political analysis. His view is always political. What happened in the later period, in early 70s, what is often known as the Calcutta trilogy, is the politics around Calcutta at that time was a lot more on your face. It was a lot more volatile. Unlike the previous times when the politics was in the background, anybody who has lived through the early 70s, politics was no longer in the background. It was the city. The city was politics. You could not avoid that. So I think he just simply reacted to that possibility. Plus, up until then, his leftist views were more, there was little hope that view will come to the main stage. Suddenly in 68, 69, the local politics in West Bengal started to change. There was the first Yukta Front government, Congress, which was then the single largest party throughout India, and almost undefeatable, was defeated. So there was this sudden hope that things might change. So I think he was also an agent provocateur in that process. And I recently saw one of the films he made right after, or mostly after the Calcutta trilogy, called Chorus. I hadn't seen it in a very, very long time, but this year they're showing a restored version in the Goa Film Festival. So somebody wanted to ask me some questions, so I pulled out an old DVD and watched the film. There you can see that his doubts about this optimism of the world changing is fading away. You can see that doubts starting to show up in Padatik, where he starts questioning the left politics of that time, the infighting and breakdown of the trade union movement because of multiple trade unions representing the workers in the same factory. And in chorus, you see three very dark tales. They are not at all hopeful. They're rather disappointing. I mean, you can see his disappointment in the process. And then the positive thing comes in the form of not in reality, not in the realistic stories, but in the fable part of it. So I can see why after that his political views were no longer as hopeful, or he was not dreaming of a new society anymore with the same intensity.
Right. Also, Kunal, talking about his early phase, and I understand from your book this very unfortunate events that happened about Mati Monisha. The way the ending was changed, and the way he was kind of blocked from actually watching his own movie because there was not much of a screening in Calcutta. And then comes Bhuvan Show, where he completely breaks out. From the form, from the way he has been doing his films in the past. So is it like, is there any kind of inspiration that happened from that events as well? Like, there's no point in aligning to the way, conventional filmmaking happens. Was there something first I wanted to understand what was the reaction when he understood that the change of the ending for Mati Manusha, and then how this breaking of the conventional form happened for Bhuvan Show?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say because Mati Manisha, I think he had a soft corner for that film even later, because he liked, as I said before, he analyzed the very old and loved story from a political standpoint. He didn't see why these two brothers would come together in today's world. So it was a political statement in some sense. But form-wise, Bhuvan Shom, I think, was a result of a number of things. How the film was financed by Film Finance Corporation. That was one of the early examples of the government giving very small amount of money, but there was money to make this film, which means that he was no longer had the moral pressure to pay back an individual. Because when an individual finances your film, no matter how much independence he exercises, there is always that interpersonal relationship. There is a person, a human being, who has put in his money, and his financiers were never rich people. So that barrier was suddenly lifted. So he had the freedom to completely experiment whatever he wanted to do, which he probably could not have done with an individual investor, with moderate means. So that was a big factor. Then came the hiring of a whole bunch of non-industry people. I mean, starting from K.K. Mahajan, the cameraman, to almost the entire crew was new. So he always loved going to Pune Film Institute and talk to the students. And he always came back, and I could see his state of elation when he came back. And he always used to say, and I'm not rhetorically, I think he really meant it, that he learned more than he taught, because the students had fresh ideas. So that also had an influence on him. So these several factors probably combined to give him the courage to try different forms. It's hard for me to know whether he was also watching other European films that influenced him at that time, that particular time. Because seeing international films in those days, even in my college days, was very, very difficult. You have to wait for one film club to bring some film, and you knew at that very moment, this is the only chance you have to see this film, and it'll never come back again. So that's a very strange thing in today's world, where everything is available. If you just have the will to watch it, you can watch it. So I don't know in the 67, 68 what kind of films he saw sitting in Calcutta. And so anyway, I'm rambling, but it's probably a combination of multiple things which gave him the courage to try completely untested narrative styles.
Right.
Kunalda, I would request you to give us some ideas on the controversy which happened with the Akash Kushum, where Satyajit Ray took a dig on Mrinal Sen. Mrinal Sen, what was his reaction, keeping in mind that he is to acknowledge Satyajit Ray's work in a big way, and is to acknowledge him as a very big director?
I was too young in those days. I was in probably 8th grade or something. I remember the excitement around me, that every morning the newspaper would come and he would open, and then he would write a reply, and then he'll read that potential reply to his friends. So I only remember the excitement around it, that there was something happening. Looking back, I find it a little puzzling why Ray reacted the way he did, because that's not his nature. So I don't know why exactly he came out of nowhere and had to criticize the review or the reviewer of the film. And once it starts, then it becomes, it's like in any argument. After a certain point, it loses any reason. You just respond to the last statement made. So it becomes, if you read through them, it becomes less substantive towards the end. It's just wordplay for both of them. And so at that point, they were just simply reacting to what happened yesterday, not in any cohesive sense. But why it started at all is a mystery to me.
How do you see Akash Kushum as a film? It was a very important film in Vinalda's career. So how do you see that?
I personally haven't watched it in the last few years. But what I remember, I think it was a funny film. He showed his humorous side in that film, which in personal life, he had a very strong sense of humor, but because he made very serious films, it never came out. So this was one of those few films, maybe a little bit in Bobon Shom, where his humorous side comes out.
And Ichapuran.
And Ichapuran, yes. Ichapuran I haven't seen since my childhood. So it's in that sense, it was important. I think there were indicators of some formal experimentation. You can see in Akash Kushum that again resurfaces in Bhuvan Shom. Apart from that, I don't know if even my father had very strong feeling towards his films. He didn't want it to be misunderstood as what Ray pointed out, that it's a wishful thinking story of a crow that's trying to behave like a peacock. But because he felt that there is a political statement to be made about the middle class and their aspirations, and you can see that same, even the dialogue come back in many of his films, where a young protagonist who is not so well-to-do often says that he'll own the city. I mean, that feeling of success, of material success. You can see that in interview, in Chalchitro, in different forms, but where younger people with limited means dream of a better life, dream of a more bourgeois life.
Yeah, and I don't know why he thought it to be a wishful one, because the way the film ends, Uh, First of all, I think it's very brave because there
Yes.
we were doing. It's more of a mainstream actually. It's not like
Yeah.
it's absolutely experimental. Apart from a few elements maybe, and the film does not give you that kind of a relief that a mainstream gives. In fact, 15 years later, when Basu Chatterjee makes a remake in Manzil, it has a very different ending and a happy ending, which he did not,
Okay. Yeah.
align to.
I haven't seen Manzil, but yeah.
It
Yeah,
has
so in
Amitabh Bachchan
Manzil,
in it. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
in
So
Manzil, they actually, he
come
rectifies
together.
himself and
Yeah.
they come
Okay.
together, yeah,
Okay.
which is 15 years later.
Yeah.
Kunal, I will also
Yeah.
ask. We have read your book. You have mentioned very less about Ritik Ghatok in the book, whereas Ritik Ghatok used to be Mrinal Sen's very close aide in the initial phase of his struggle phase, as well as during his filmmaking phase.
Whereas he kind of, loved the city. Ritik
Hmm.
never settled to the city at all, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Always going back to East Bengal.
Yeah. Ritik Ghatok, I used to call him Ritik Kaka, so I'll refer to him as that. Um, he had a very strong, obviously, an extremely strong feeling about the separation, about the partition. And so that feeds into many of his films. Whereas my father came before partition happened. He came and immediately fell in love with the city. So he would have been in Calcutta no matter what, even if the country remained, the state remained undivided. So for him, he didn't have any strong feeling about the separation. Plus, he consciously always disliked um, nostalgia. I wrote about that. It's hard for me to say whether he really didn't have nostalgia or he decided not to have nostalgia, whether it was a conscious thing or a natural thing. I think it's a little bit of both. He did have some nostalgic feeling, but he tried to suppress that as he felt it leads to sentimentalism, etc. Regarding Ritik Ghatak and my father, they had very different point of views, and this is something that is remarkable in to me, that these three filmmakers, Ray, my father, and Ghatak, they were working in the same city at the same time, yet they could make such different films. They're entirely different films. They didn't influence each other in any obvious way. That's kind of remarkable because normally there is more influencing. Unfortunately, my memory of Ritik Kaka was not a good one. When I became old enough to remember things or understand things, let's say from the 70s onwards, and I wrote that in my film, it's a huge regret for me that I have almost never seen him when he's not drunk. And so I was actually afraid of him coming to our house, because if my father was there, it was an awkward thing that he is a completely drunk person. And even more so when my father was not at home and I opened the door and he would come in, and he was like most drunk people. He was abusive and unpredictable. So I was actually literally afraid of him. And I have, even in the studios, once in a while I was there when I saw them meet, there was no conversation because one person was almost always drunk, and you cannot have a meaningful conversation in that state. And I find it shocking and very disturbing that we try to glorify that. Alcoholism is a disease. It's like any other disease. It can affect anybody, an eminent person or a commoner. But it's a disease, and it was a disease that he was afflicted with. I wish he didn't have that disease. He would have made much better work. But trying to connect that with his social angst, etc., is pointless. It's an alcoholism. It's a disease that affected him like anybody else who is affected by that. And he would have been much better off. We would all be much better off if he didn't have that disease.
I was very interested to know, the second phase of his filmmaking, when his more politically loaded films come, and as you say, the political environment in the state was going through a big change. And now, from your writing, we also understand that he was not much supportive of the ultra left. And yet, when we look into these films, say Interview or Kolkata 71 and all, there's a sense of radical provocation that comes in. So as a person, and when you discuss with him, and so many things were happening around in the city. So what was his perspective of what's happening around, and how did he think about this balance to be laid? Or did he consider the practicality of it at all?
I don't think he was ever a very practical person in private life or otherwise. But what excited him was, I wouldn't say that he was against the ultra left, because he was excited by all the things that were happening in the Naxal period. But he was equally disturbed that there is a fight going on between CPIM and CPI-ML, and they were killing each other. And that disturbed him tremendously. And you can see that come up in Podatik, where he's asking the question of who is your friend. So he was at once excited by student movements, even if it is radical. But at the same time, he was questioning the politics of it, of killing ordinary policemen or taking down statues and breaking up science labs in a college. So he could never understand that. He could never support that. So it was a dichotomy that he suffered during those days, that what is right, what is wrong. He was excited by the radicalness of the movement, but he was a very he didn't like violence. You'll never see any violence in any of his films. Even when, like in Mriga, there is a sequence of hunting, but you never see the hunting because he never liked violence. I remember in his very late age, in his late 80s and 90s, I would go to Calcutta at least 3 or 4 times a year. And one day, or not one day, I mean, quite often I would be sitting in our dining table. He's there, and I was flipping television channels, and I would go into National Geographic, which he normally didn't watch. He only watched news channels. But he was kind of pleasantly surprised by these nature films, except whenever there is a hunting sequence of a bigger predatory animal killing another animal, he would be immediately turned off, and he said, "I'm not liking it. Change the channel." So he never liked violence, but he liked the radical ideas of a violent politics. So when actually the violence came into existence, he didn't like it. I remember there was a policeman, a constable, who was murdered, stabbed right in front of our house in the 70s during the Naxal period. And I still remember how disturbed he was by this fact, and he almost fictionalized it in a piece that he wrote at that time, that maybe this person was coming back from the market with a few potatoes, etc. His wife is waiting. I mean, he portrayed the picture of a very lower middle class person who gets killed for no reason at all. So I still remember how disturbed he was, and he refers to it in one of his films. There was, of course, the other factor was I was young in those days. I was in 11th grade or first year college. And in those days, whenever there was any such operation in your neighborhood, all the kids are picked up by the police for interrogation. Yeah. So there was a personal fear also that whether it'll affect me. But anyway, I digressed away from your question. But yes, to come back, that he was divided when it came to the left politics. He liked the possibility of a change, but the process he couldn't like.
Really, this has been a riveting conversation till now, Kunalda. I will come back to the book. My question is that your love and care and late found respect for your father is oozing out of your book, and there's also reservations about his obsession, about his likings, his self-centeredness, which, as you say, affected your mother the most. Now, looking in retrospect, do you feel one cannot be an accomplished filmmaker, or for that matter, an artist, without such self-centered nature? Because we have other examples of such artists, which we have seen as well.
Yes, I mean, I have been extremely fortunate to see many rather successful people closely as my father's friends. And if there is one thing in common between them, they're all self-centered. So I think, yes, it is probably a requisite of being very successful. But here's the problem, that if you are self-centered and you succeed, then it becomes something that you make a case out of, that it's such a great thing. It's dedication, it's focus. If you are not successful, then you are left out as a selfish person. So it's success cleanses it up. But I think, yes, that's probably one of the key components of being successful. Another thing that I noticed among them, among many of them, is if you think he had some defects, like he was not very organized thinker, and he didn't plan everything, and there are several such qualities. He somehow turned those bad qualities into assets. So I think that's also another, everyone has some great qualities and bad qualities. The more successful people probably somehow, knowingly or unknowingly, convert their weaknesses into assets. He used his disorganized thing to make films that feel a lot more dynamic, that as if it's happening right there. So I have several other examples, but I have seen it also among other people. So you are given a hand with some good cards, some bad cards, but you flip those bad cards into good cards. If you can manage to do that, now you have a handful of all good cards. So I think that's also helped him and many other people I have seen.
Right. Well, talking about the third phase, when he was making more introspective films, Kharij, Chalchitro, Ek Din Achanak, and all of that. So we kind of comprehend it like, there was a disillusionment with the left government, the way he thought it to be and the way it turned out it to be. And, this middle class that we see is kind of a representation of himself and his peers, who were thought to be that, liberal socialist, but turned out to be somewhere self-centered, somewhat with, certain kind of regressive ideologies, regressive social ideologies, which was never in alignment with which the movement began. So was he thinking in the same way in his personal life, personal space as well, and which reflects in these films?
To some extent. I mean, he was always questioning his own self. I mean, you can see that he's questioning his self as a socially conscious artist in Akale Shandhane, which is entirely about how much of reality can we really capture. And it again comes back, the same story comes back. There is a documentary that a German filmmaker made on him, where Reinhard Hoff and he was talking, and he talks about they both talk about the same thing of how any creative artist uses their surrounding, uses their experience for their own benefit. So that kind of thing was there. Then in other films, like for example, in Ek Din Achanak, you see him questioning the crisis of mediocrity in anybody. And mediocrity is not only for mediocre people. I mean, that I have seen again in my personal interaction with these people, with my father and others, that no matter how successful you are in public eye, as you become successful, your standard also goes up. You start comparing yourself to others who are at the same level or higher. So you always feel mediocre. I don't believe there is anybody in this world who is not insane, who cannot not feel mediocre at some level, because there is always something else you are aspiring. So he had that sense of mediocrity, and that came out there. Plus, I think the ultra radical politics was no longer there that was there in the 70s. So things have calmed down, and he was asking deeper questions about society, about his reality, and about himself. And he was always very, it was very easy for him to be self-critical. I mean, we all say that we would love to be self-critical, but I've watched him closely. He could be genuinely self-critical. And that reflected in many of his films. Self-critical, not just as an individual, but as a member of the society. Even in a film that doesn't have any political sense, Kandahar, you can see the self-critical notion of the irresponsibility, the lack of taking responsibility of the middle class, that we get involved only up to a certain extent and then remain aloof. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah.
Kunal, the discussion has come to a very interesting juncture. You have given a lot of rationale and reasoning in your book, but wanted to check with you. Mrinal Sen never worked with your uncle Anup Kumar, renowned actor, or that matter, Subrata Mitro, one of the most prolific cinematographer of the time. So wanted to, did you have any discussion around this? Any insight you can throw on this?
Yes. With my uncle, that was a constant conflict between me and my father, because I loved my uncle. I could sense that there is a hurt somewhere that he never is used by my father. But my father's argument was that Anup Kumar always used to play roles, mostly comedic roles. And in this formula Bengali films, the moment he came on screen, even before he has uttered the first dialogue, people would start laughing. The audience would start laughing, because there is an expectation of him doing something funny. And that's what my father dreaded, that here is a person who would come on screen with a set expectation. Now, he has used later on very, very prominent actors like Shabana Azmi or Nasiruddin Shah, but none of them, they somehow managed their career very, very carefully, I think consciously, not to get stereotyped as a particular character. Nasiruddin can play anything. So you have, when you start watching the film, you don't know what his character would be. Whereas with Anup Kumar, that thing was always there, that he was seen as a comedic actor. Plus, in his acting, there was a lot of mannerisms. I mean, he had developed his own mannerisms that people liked, but my father was afraid of. So he did use him in some of his earlier films, but later on it wasn't so. Then people asked the question, he used Robbie Ghosh in chorus, how come? And I think Robbie Ghosh had less comedic mannerisms than my uncle. So he was more of a flexible person. He used Utpal Datta, who eventually became a comedic character, but he haven't used it since he became one. I remember my father used to tease Utpal Datta. At that time, there was a young boy who worked in our house, Ram, and who was a avid Hindi film watcher. And when Utpal Datta became a big comedic name in Hindi films, so my father once asked Ram, what do you think of Utpal Datta? And he very seriously thought for a while, and he said, he's good, but not as good as Asrani. So my father used to teach Utpal Kaka that now you have, look where you have brought yourself down to, that you are good, but you are not as good as Asrani.
Yeah, but Onam Kumar was so good in Nimantron and Palatak, right? Tarun Majumdar actually brought the stereotypes.
Exactly. So that was my argument often, but it somehow I could never convince me and my mother. We both argued with my father, but he was very stubborn about it. And the second one you asked about.
Subrata Mitra.
Subrata Mitra was he was a very, very close friend of my father. So they were extremely connected. And my father, several times, he thought of using him and he discussed it internally, but always backed out at the last moment because they were very, very different personalities. Subrata Kaka, and I also had separately a very close relationship with him. He was obsessed about his machines, about his cameras and sound recording. And his obsession was such that he would not trust anybody to go into. There was one room where he kept these things, but I for some reason he trusted me as an engineer enough to let me into that world, into his machine world. And I have seen how obsessive he can be. And to the point where even Satyajit Ray, who was a perfectionist himself, could not work with Subrata Mitra after a certain point because there were conflicts. And my father was worried that if they worked together, that would end their friendship, because my father liked the Mahajan style of filmmaking, that you take a camera, you jump out of a car, you don't have time to adjust or measure lights, you just do it and hope for the best. Whereas Subrata Kaka would modify every single thing. I remember one conversation when Subrata Mitra got interested in sound, and he recorded the sound music for one of my father's films. And he was telling this story that some probably foreign film company was asking for some sound samples from him. And they were asking for the sound of a horse-drawn cart. In typical Bengali films, those were done by empty shells of coconut rocked on the ground. It's a foley sound. I mean, you didn't really record. So Subrata Mitra asked them, so this sound, what kind of horse cart is it? Is it a Victoria? There were all these different kinds of, because he was worried about, because each one would have a different acoustic. So they didn't even think of that. They said which kind. Then he said, is the sound from inside the car or where the driver sits outside? Because the sound changes. Then they answered that. Then he said, is the road, is it a concrete road or a cobbled street made of stone? Because that changes the sound. So he was that kind of a finicky person. He would ask every single detail, and it's very difficult to work with him unless you have that kind of budget and mindset.
I would like to, Kunalda, I would like to ask about one of Mrinal Sen's friend, Marquez. If you can just elaborate about their friendship, and this is a unique thing which we read, and it's like, if you can elaborate a bit about their friendship.
So they met, I'm forgetting the year, there was a Cannes Film Festival where my father was a member of the jury and Marquez was also a member of the jury. This is before he got his Nobel Prize. And it was a very, very interesting festival, because when I look at the films that were there in competition in that year, it's a who's who of every major filmmaker in the world at that time. But anyway, so during that festival, they got close because they had similar, among the jury members here, they had similar political views. And there was a Cuban film, which neither of them liked very much. But towards the end of the festival, Marquez was trying to canvass to my father that we must get this film some kind of an award, because he promised Castro that he will. Then they were very good friends. So my father said, but it's a bad film. And he said, okay, just raise this issue in the jury meeting that I can't do it myself because people know my connection. If you could raise the question, if we could award this film as a representative of Cuban cinema. So my father very reluctantly raised that question, and everyone immediately shut it down, because they said it's a festival of individual films, not about cinema of a particular country. But anyway, so they became close at that time to some extent, because he spent 7-10 days together all the time. And right after he came back from Cannes, his Nobel Prize was announced, and they had some male connection. In those days, that was the only way you could retain some connection. And then my parents were invited to a film school in Cuba, which was where he was associated. So that was a 2-week period when my parents were there, and this is not a festival, not thousands of people, not watching films. So it was a quiet place where he had to take a couple of classes, but most of the time he was completely free, and so was Marquez. So that was 1-2 week period when they spent a lot of time together. But after that, there was it's not a sustained friendship that they met every so often. And then he received a mail one day, apparently from Marquez, with a poem where he's talking about death and or impending death, and very sentimental. And my father, remember, he said that he must be very ill, because he's not this kind of a sentimental person. But eventually it was discovered that was not written by him. This was a ventriloquist from Mexico. He created this, essentially a fake letter that he wrote and sent it to many of his friends.
I'd like to know from you, Kunalda, that what is your favorite Mrinal Sen film? Not from the perspective of an insider, of course, but as a general audience, a general admirer of cinema, what would be your favorite Mrinal Sen film?
That's a very hard thing for me to. I mean, I can name a few, but not one. I mean, I still enjoy Bhuvansham for its freshness, because of its style. It has a beautiful feel to it. I like Padati because of its political analysis of a complex situation. I like Kandahar because I think it has a beautiful story and storytelling. I like both Akdin Pratidin, Courage, for what it's trying to say and how it said it. There's another film that's not critically acclaimed, but I find it very modern, which is Chalchitro. It's a very modern film, but I don't think the Indian audience was ready or even ready today, because we like stories. We like wholesome stories.
We were just actually discussing that, me and Shubhadeep, that Chalchitro seems to be his most underrated film, perhaps. It's such a beautiful film. There are so many sequences. I just cannot forget that sequences where all those moments suddenly start washing the floor just because one start, and then everyone starts doing that. There are very, very beautiful sequences suddenly coming out of nowhere in that film.
Yes, I find it. I mean, it's not that I like everything in that film. I mean, that's hard to do. But overall, I think it's a very, very modern portrayal of a particular time. And Anjan Datta has made a film called Chalchitro Ekhon, which is, I don't think it has been shown yet, but it'll be shown in the Calcutta Film Festival, where it deals with his relationship with a young actor, with a filmmaker, a much older filmmaker, during the making of Chalchitro. But it was underrated, and it was not even shown. What happened was the film was completed, and it was to be sent to some film festival, Europe. I don't remember. And this created one print, sent that print over, and they didn't like the quality of the print. I mean, very often the lab work in India was not up to standard. So they suggested that they wanted the negative, and they would create their own print. And either they didn't have the money to create a duplicate negative, because you can make a dupe negative, or there was not enough time. So they sent the original negative to this festival. They made a print, sent back the negative, and the negative got lost in Calcutta Customs. So the film was never released because there was no negative to print it from. Now what we see is those two surviving prints, one that was printed in India and one that was printed by the European Film Festival. So it's a lost film in a sense, but two prints survived.
And tell me, Kunal, that just because we were talking about Chalchitro, I think there's something about Suits and Mrinal Sen, is it? Like the film starts with the way, this man comes in suits and then he slowly disrobes. In interview, there is this sequence where Rajit Modlik attacks this man and queen with suits. Even in Akash Kushum, like, the way he is showing Shaumitro's aspirations through suits, and the way he borrows it from Shubhendu Chatterjee's character. So he was very, very, critical of this, the way we dress up the European way, is it?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting connection. I never thought of that. But it's probably because you have to remember, he grew up in a time when I always saw him wearing dhoti and kurta when I was young, and then dhoti transitioned into pajamas. But he must have, as a member of the lower middle class Bengali society, he realized that he gets discriminated sometimes. I mean, there are places where he cannot go because of his lack of westernization. So I think it's not the clothing, but it's the lack of westernization. Now it seems with his success and that why should he worry? But good part of his younger life, he could not achieve these things. He was, even in his dress, there was a line drawn, and he was on one side of that line, and there were other people enjoying certain privileges who were on the other side, which is the suit thing. I mean, he never had a suit, and later on, it may be a conscious decision not to wear it, but earlier it was just not. I mean, middle class people didn't have suits. So I think it was, to him, it was a symbolic separation. There are many things. I mean, he probably aspired or had some degree of regret that he couldn't enjoy certain things because of his visible identity. Now we can't see that. I mean, but there was a time when there was a visible identity between the lower middle class and the upper middle class by how they dressed.
Right.
All these people, I mean, Hemanta Mukherjee, from their contemporaries, they never wore pants. You never see them in Western clothes.
Right. I think that there's also this sequence in Akale Shandhane where this one character, one of the heroines, she's wearing a maxi when there is a death, and then there is a fallout around it.
Yes, right. Yeah, he also had this, which is also in Akale Shandhane, he had this obsession about eyebrow plucking.
Yes, Devika's character. Yes,
It's
correct. We witnessed.
Even in private life, if anybody came to him to act, there would always be this, he would get turned off the moment he saw anybody who plucked their eyebrows. And my wife, Nisha, would often tease him, saying that, you don't say, I pluck my eyebrows. And he said, oh, you are not acting in films.
Right.
Yeah.
Also, tell me, Kunal, I mean, when I was reading through your book, and then, I was also understanding this arc to him as a person. Like, a lot of things that you talk about in his early days becomes different traits as he ages. You talk about how he took care of your wife when her father died, and he never reprimanded her when she was doing this small role. And there's so many things which does not fit into the person which is otherwise him in his early days. So do you think he was also thinking about things he might have not done in the past, or he was trying, in a way, trying to make it up to you?
Could be. I never thought of it that way, but it could be that with age he was taking a longer perspective and trying to control his behavior. But it was not. It was more of a partiality towards people in his family. I mean, the day when Nisha, my wife, was making mistakes during a small sequence in Ek Din Pratidin, she didn't get scolded for those mistakes. But right after that, there was a shot of another older person in the same sequence, and he made a mistake, and he got all the scolding of both for my wife and himself. So he didn't change as much, but he was partial. I mean, I mentioned in my book, whenever he used actors from Bombay in Bengali films, like Dimple in Antarin or Smita in Akale Shandhane, he dubbed their voice using some other actress. Now, of course, no actor wants their voice to be dubbed by somebody else. But he tried, and they could not get the Bengali pronunciation, so he eventually switched. I can't blame him for doing that, but I also can't blame the actors for not being happy about that decision. However, when it came to my mother in Kandahar, where her Bengali accent comes through very, very clearly, he kept it. He should have got it dubbed by some Hindi speaker. But his argument was, oh no, while dubbing both Shabana and Nasir and all the other people, they said, oh, Kitati is doing fine. So I'm going by that. I don't understand accents, which may be true. I mean, maybe Nasir and Shabana, they both said she was good because they wanted her voice to stay. But that's where, again, sort of partiality comes through when it comes to family people.
Yeah.
Right. Kunal, we are coming towards the end, so I'm going to ask you a controversial question. So, with the disclaimer, so you have mentioned in the interview and even in your book that Mrinal Sen was against the idea of nostalgia, and yet, if we look at Bengali cinema today, it's mostly sucking up to the idea of nostalgia, which includes films being made this year as a tribute to your father, Mrinal Sen. What is your take on these films and Bengali cinema overall?
I don't watch too many Bengali films. I mean, that's my disclaimer, and it's not because I cannot find them, but it's I lead an unusual, exceptionally, and I don't like it, a busy life, so I have little time to watch films. So I can't say mostly about all Bengali cinema, but I agree that whatever I have seen, there is a tendency of nostalgia, and even the films that are well made and good, but they often deal with problems which are very personal problems, not necessarily societal problems. My general opinion about, and again, this is a very risky statement to make without watching many Indian films, that the current trend of Indian films is making safe films, films that are more likely to be enjoyed by a larger audience. And I can see why that is the case, because all of these films, even the better made films, more well-meaning films, are fairly high budget films. They're very polished productions. And when you make a high budget film, which is what my father always tried to fight against, he always believed that the moment you spend too much money, you become answerable to, and you have to compromise somewhere. You have to do things that are liked. So nostalgia is a very common sentiment, and problems of the upper middle class is something that is understood by the moviegoers, especially those who can spend several hundred rupees for a ticket. So it makes sense why these people often make films on such topics. I mean, for example, rural India is almost gone from films nowadays. You almost never see them because it's not something that the audience can relate to. Not that it doesn't happen. I saw one film last year, Dostaji, which was on a rural subject, which is commendable that somebody had the courage to do that. But most films are now on upper middle class problems, confined in small houses and what's happening in there. And not that they're very well made films. I mean, probably most of these films are better made than any film my father has made, technically and polish wise. But it's my regret that I see too much of safe films. And my expectation was with digital technology that you can shoot with a small camera, SLR camera, you can edit at home, we will see a lot more very adventurous films. And I've been told recently that there are such films being made, but they're hard to find. They're not theatrically released. So I would love to see those, but my guess is my father, if he was making films today, he would have adopted many of these technologies to further lower the production cost and have the freedom to experiment even more.
Yeah.
Indian documentaries are making a mark, actually, exactly what the films are not doing, maybe, for the last few
Yes,
years.
I mean, I saw two documentaries recently meaning in the last 3 years. Both these documentaries got the best documentary award at Cannes. Okay, um, and they're almost never watched in India, which is sad. I mean, I've spoken with many film people who are film enthusiasts. They haven't even heard of one of those films last year. But that's the interesting thing, that in the last 20, 30 years, after my father's time, that era was gone. I don't see almost any Indian film getting selected in the competition section of the major festivals. They are there, but not in the main competition. What has changed? What has changed? Is it that all the film festivals have become partial against India? I hardly doubt it, because they are in the business of showing interesting films. In any art form, what is ultimately appreciated is something that is unexpected. You have to surprise the audience somehow, either in form or content or something. And the reason they don't get selected, my opinion is, they're not surprising films. There is nothing, they're good films, but they don't shock you or surprise you in any way that would wake up the audience and say, okay, this should be shown and selected in the main competition. Whereas in the same environment, these documentaries are doing that. So it is not a question of bias on the part of the film festival, nor is it a question of lack of creativity among Indian filmmakers. It is the choice that feature filmmakers are making. The trend has changed. There is a desire to make likable films, broadly likable films. So it's sort of like the Hollywood model. I mean, there are good films that are made in Hollywood, but they're never as surprising as the French New Wave. And that's what is missing nowadays.
And I think that's exactly what your father used to do, because I think he changed his form also every 2-3 films, right? Like, I mean, if you go through the sequence of filmography, even if a form which is very new for Indian context, because he has worked with it for a couple of films, maybe he used to change it, just maybe surprising himself.
Right. Yes, I mean, that's something I would say is very commendable as an artist, because anywhere in the world, an artist always looks for the right material, either in content or in form or both. And once they find it, and this is not just filmmakers, in any kind of art, in literature, in painting, once you find that and then you get critical acclaim, there is a huge pressure to stay with that, to stick with it, and churn out more and more of the same, because it works and people have liked it. It takes a tremendous amount of courage to move away from it. That is, ignore that and try something completely different. And my father constantly did that. Every 3 or 4 films he changed. Not that it always worked, but it didn't bother him. And that, I would say, is not because he's just simply courageous. As a person, he never thought of consequences. This was a defect. This is what I was talking about, turning a defect into an asset. So we have a chess player in all of us. We always think, before doing anything, we think, okay, if I do this, what will happen? What will that person say? And then we try to think, okay, if they say so, what will I respond? it's a chess game. We think several moves ahead. He just didn't have that capability. He never could think beyond what he was thinking today. And he somehow that led to a situation of taking a lot more chances. I mean, I wrote about this, I think, in my book, that when Bhuvan Shom was selected in Venice, that was his first film that was going to one of the three major film festivals. It was a big deal. And they invited him, and they gave him economy class plane ticket. My father has never flown anything but economy, and he didn't fly much in any case. But he immediately realized that obviously all the other international filmmakers who are coming to the festival, they're not giving them economy class tickets. So he immediately wrote back saying, send me a first class ticket or else I won't go. Now, this is again, he was not going after the comfort of first class. I mean, he didn't even know what it was. It was a question of rights and dignity. But if he was a calculating person, if he was a chess player, he wouldn't have taken that chance. What if they said, okay, you don't have to come. This is all we can give. That could have happened. He didn't know that. But he was not calculating of that possibility and said so. And obviously, immediately they said it was a clerical mistake, and they sent a first-class ticket. But this is, again, a great example of that he didn't think through things, and that came to his benefit at times.
Right. I think we have had a great discussion today, Kunalda, and thank you so much for joining us today and telling us so much about your father and your relationship with him and his cinema. This was truly eye-opening. We are really indebted to you for this interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.